Yes, I think this is where we're going to talk about takeouts, sort of key takeouts. If you do nothing else, what are some of our points that we'd like to land with you? So again, just sort of a lot of this you will have heard, but what are the key things that we recommend? So I'll start, which is to pause, stop creating stuff. It becomes a cyclical thing where people create more and more stuff and add layers upon layers because the thing that they've created in the first place doesn't quite work. So my starting point would be stop creating more stuff. Heather, what about you?
So I think my starting point would be to really then go into what is it that you want to change. In other words, if what you're saying is nobody's setting goals properly, if it's as simple as that, and that's a very common reason why people initially pick up the phone or send me a WhatsApp or contact us through our website, they're feeling that goals aren't being set properly. And when you go in, you go, well, what? All right, so they're not setting goals properly. So when they are setting goals properly, what is it that you expect will be different? And then you start to unpick actually what the problem is. And the problem may be that we're not delivering results, or it may be that there are a lot of poor performers in the organization who aren't being held to account, or it may be, and classically in some organizations, there's too much of people going off and working on pet projects and not enough focus on core activities. So I think I always begin with, when we've done whatever it is we're going to do, and that's our job as professionals to work out what to do, what is the difference? So then, Belinda, where would you then go?
Well, one of the things I really love about the performance management canvas that you use as sort of fundamental to your work, and it's obviously talked a lot about in the book, it really speaks to me of human-centered design because what's at the core of the performance management canvas, as I say, is the experience that we're trying to create for our people and for our managers. And actually, if you design around how managers operate and how people come to work and how they show up, then the whole thing that you're creating is going to be much more likely to land. And what I also like about the canvas is it really brings in, and you've already touched on it, this idea of don't just talk to leaders, don't just talk to HR, don't just talk to managers, talk to employees as well to find out how this is going to work, how this is going to land. I think once you go through that human-centered design approach and take a very agile, iterative approach to continue to go back to test and learn about what does and doesn't work and continue to iterate, you tend to get a performance management system, however light or heavy that might end up being, that really works in the context of that organization. And that's absolute odds to over designing something enormous and then throwing it out there and just praying that it's going to work. It's a completely different approach to what is happening in too many organizations. So human-centered design, working with people to understand what's needed and what's going to work.
I think and you trigger me, and it's not on this slide, but again, it's one of the mantras that we have in 3C, this statement that I own my performance and my manager manages it. And that's not a desired state. That is reality. That's what's going on all day, every day. That in the end, my manager can, put out some carrots and some sticks around what they want me to do. They can be clear as they possibly can, but the only person who can actually alter what I do is me. And therefore, yes, I might need support. Yes, I might need guidance. Hopefully, I'm up for it anyway. But I own my performance and my manager manages it. And that is totally this human-centered design that you talk about, Belinda. I think this is why it's so great when we work together, because though in a sense we've come at these issues from very different starting points, we've ended up absolutely at a complete kind of coherence between getting the culture and the performance to be a coherent tool rather than to be working at odds to each other. I think the next thing that I would say, though, then, that unfortunately, and I'm sure that many of you on this call will know that this is what you have to do, is you have to get a business case in order to take action. And the trouble is, getting a business case from our culture and our performance aren't really working together very well doesn't really cut it with a lot of senior managers, when you might really want to spend some money, and not just money, but you're asking them to invest their time and their precious resources in doing something that, as we've heard, doesn't come naturally to them. So the business case really needs to pick into what came out of that first question from us about what actually needs to change. When we've got that change, what is that change worth to us? And then doing that work, and that change, the worth if you're in a not-for-profit might be quite different to the worth if you're in a FTSE 100. But establishing the worth of investing in the change is really, really important. Okay, one more point, Belinda, and then I'll wrap up, and then we can take a chance to have some questions.
Um, I think you've said it all. What would I add to that? What would I add to that? I've got nothing to add to that. I'm looking at the
You've
chat
got
and the questions. Actually, I tell you what I do. I'm going to answer a question in the chat because I think it
okay. In
was.
that case, I'm going to stop the share and I'm going to have a little quick look. Right, okay, pick up a question.
I'm going to pick up Jeanette's question, who asks, is culture more important than strategy? Now, I'm going to resist the temptation to throw out the breakfast quote because
Yeah,
everybody's heard it
yeah.
before. Um, I don't think it's more important than strategy. I think strategy and culture are the two most significant levers that an organization have got to pull to achieve organizational success. But if you don't look after culture, you won't be able to deliver on your strategy. So ignoring one at the expense of another is never going to work. But I think they're equally important.
I think I'm going to resist the breakfast quote, but I think one of my favorite books from, I mean, written many years ago now, and I know a lot of the specifics of it have changed, but if any of you've read Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, it's really interesting in that he talks about getting the right people on the bus before you really worry too much about where the bus is going. Now, I think obviously he's talking about the organization already exists and therefore it's already got something that it needs to do. Clearly, strategy is there to tell you what you are there to do. So you've got a vision, mission, strategy. What are you fundamentally there to do? And your culture surely is that thing around how is this group of people in this set of circumstances going to deliver that result? And I mean, it's really easy. Even if you look at something simple like banking, we may be offering retail banking services, but you go into a member-led organization like Nationwide, or you go into one of the challenger banks, say like Starling, or and by go into, I don't necessarily mean walk into. And those organizations are both providing similar services, but they have very different cultures, which are leading them to very, very different market positions. Yeah, interesting.
Hedda,
Oh, what else we?
I was
Yeah,
going to throw a
Belinda.
question to you also from Jeanette. Well, actually, it's a comment rather than a question. But successful performance management approach is perhaps about staff awards, individual as well as team recognition. So we've touched on that a little
Yeah,
bit, but love to hear your
yeah,
thoughts on that.
yeah. No, great. And we did an entire white paper, which if anybody wants it, Jeanette, if you haven't got it, just pop a note in there called How to Make Performance Related Pay Work for You. So that's about reward, not just award. We absolutely need to acknowledge individuals. Of course we do. We all want acknowledgement. We all want to be there. Um, Yet it's very, very, very rare in an organization to find people who are truly individual contributors, that most of us are in operating somewhere where things are coming at us from some people and we need to pass on to other people, even if we're working on them on our own at a moment. Um, I'm just thinking back to some work I did in the NHS and some of the stuff that really struck me in the NHS that I think all the leaders in the NHS knows culture is really important, but I was always struck by how in individual wards you could go into one ward and the culture would be very, very different to going into the ward next door. And that came from leaders. But I think, and this is why I'm talking about in answer to this, that in some cultures, people feel valued. People feel really valued. And that is some aspect of recognition. Whether that's actually an award, whether that's employee of the month or a bonus, that might vary. But recognition, I would say, is probably as important as reward, if not, notwithstanding there's a cost of living crisis and there are many people on low wages for whom every penny counts. But Belinda, what's your thoughts?
Yeah, when we're talking about monetary returns for employment, we're sort of in the hygiene level of this. So you need to pay people enough, of course you do. So it takes it off the table. But actually, by paying people more, you don't necessarily elevate the experience that somebody's having in that organization. Neither
Yeah,
do you necessarily elevate their performance. So I do a lot of
yeah,
work around employee experience, and as you said, feeling valued and appreciated and belonging and recognized for the work that you're doing is much more than a monetary return
yeah,
for it.
yeah. Yeah.
And if you get those, the good news is when you get those things right and you create the experience is somebody's individual experience of working in that organization, which is influenced by culture, how they're managed, et cetera, et cetera. When you get that experience right, people are naturally become higher performers. And that's, you can see a great employee experience translating into high performance for organizations across multiple dimensions. So productivity, financial performance, customer satisfaction, et cetera, et cetera. So get the experience right for your people, they will perform and the organization will succeed.
So, got a question earlier up. I was looking earlier up the chat, and Meg was asking about successful performance management approaches. So, Meg, one thing I'm not going to do is to say this solution works, because this solution worked for that organization at that time in that place. So the examples that I might give when you're thinking about successful performance management approaches are, where do they connect with the organization's purpose? So one of the examples that I like to give is to think about airlines. Now, I know airlines are, particularly through COVID, obviously they had a very tough time and things go up and down, and they can vary. But if you think about an organization like EasyJet's profitability is based on speed, right? How fast they can turn those planes around, how fast they can get you on board, how fast they can unload, because the more time that those planes are in the air, the more those assets are being sweated, and the more successful the organization will be. Therefore, you need to create a culture where speed of decision making, confidence in working fast, the ability to just think, the ability to move fast is valued, right? And when they got that right, they grew and grew and grew and were very successful. Now we could then compare that. Let us compare that to British Airways. British Airways, as it came out of public sector ownership, decided to invest heavily in a service-led and a quality-led ethos. And for quite a long time, they were never the cheapest, but their service was such that many people were prepared to pay what their premium was, because the service culture supported what they felt they needed from their experience. Now, what happened over time was that the pricing then got out of hand, and then British Airways maybe slightly lost its way and began to struggle with pricing, and then lost their customer service. But the way in which they then managed their performance at the peak of their customer service game was about, have we always put the customer first? Is the first question we ask ourselves, what's going to work best for the customer in this situation? Is the second question we ask ourselves, how can I make this customer have the best possible customer experience? And so on. You can see that managing performance in that context would be very different. And they were very, very successful for a while in managing that. And then things changed and they didn't move on. Belinda, have you got a positive example of where perhaps performance and culture have meshed perfectly?
Yeah, an example that springs to mind is from Experian, and it was when they were redesigning their approach to performance management. And they took this very human-centered design approach to it. So they involved employees, managers, and leaders throughout at every step of the process. And rather than spending a long time building something in isolation and then throwing it over the wall and hope it lands. They built it in small increments. And for me, I've got this lovely visual image of one of the stages of that is that one of the challenges to this sort of incremental design approach can be that it's slow and it can seem to be like taking a lot of time, but it might be slightly slower, but it lands. And this visual image I have of how this worked in practice is when they got to what they thought this whole process was going to look like, they actually took over a room in their in the office and created a paper interface, like a mock-up interface of each piece of that performance management process. And they got leaders, managers, and employees to walk through, thinking, literally walking through the room, thinking about this process and how their experience of it might be, and leave comments along, what works, what doesn't, even better ifs. And I just think that approach to engaging all of your stakeholders along the process and building in small incremental steps. And then you have got something to launch that's going to land well. I think for me, that is bringing their culture of design and employee centricity and their need to improve performance to it brings those two together really neatly. And I love that visual image of them walking the room.
That's a lovely way for us to end, I think.